Okay, so have you ever, really stopped to think about what makes us human? I mean, what is it that actually makes us us?
It's a question that seems simple on the surface, but gets really complicated really fast.
Yeah, for sure. And it's not just, an idle thought experiment.
hmm
This question of human nature has huge implications. I mean, it touches everything from ethics and politics to how we understand ourselves and our place in the universe.
Absolutely. And that's what makes this Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry you sent over so fascinating. It dives headfirst into this whole enduring mystery.
Right, it's like a deep dive into the deep dive.
Uh-huh, exactly.
And right off the bat, it struck me how there isn't one simple answer. This concept of human nature is incredibly layered. I mean, even whether such a thing exists is up for debate.
Totally. There are so many different perspectives on what human nature even means. Like, is it about our biology, our
Right.
behavior, our capacity for reason, our social structures?
It's kind of dizzying, honestly. So, our mission for this deep dive is to unpack some of those different ways philosophers have tackled this question, see where they agree, where they clash, and try to understand why this whole debate continues to be so relevant, even today.
And what's great is that this encyclopedia entry gives us a solid framework to work with.
Yeah, a roadmap for navigating this philosophical jungle. So let's start with what the entry calls the traditional package of ideas about human nature. We're
Yeah.
talking ancient Greece here, those philosophical heavyweights like Plato and Aristotle.
Right. They laid the groundwork for a lot of Western thought on this topic. And it wasn't just one single definition they offered, but more like a set of related claims, almost like criteria for understanding what it means to be human.
Okay, so like a checklist for humanity. What are the main bullet points on that list?
Well, the first one is what they call the contrastive view. Basically, they define human nature by what it isn't.
What it isn't. Okay, now I'm intrigued.
So, the idea is that human nature is everything that's not artificial or intentionally created by humans. They had this word for the things we create, techne. So, strip away all of that, all the stuff we build, all our technology, our social rules, and what you're left with, that's the core of our nature.
So it's like saying our true selves are what remain when you remove all the layers of civilization.
Exactly. That's the starting point. Then they add another layer, what they call the blueprint explanatory view.
A blueprint, like a set of instructions.
Yeah, think of it like how an acorn has a built-in set of instructions that guides its development into a mighty oak tree.
Okay, so humans have a blueprint too.
That's what they were getting at. They believed that we have these inherent features that guide us towards our full potential. And for Aristotle, that blueprint for all living things was the soul.
Now, when they talk about the soul, they don't mean some spooky ghost in the machine kind of thing, right?
Yeah. No, not at all. For Aristotle, the soul was more about the functional organization of a living being. It's like the integrated set of capacities that allow us to do the things we do, to live and grow and flourish.
Oh, interesting. So it's less about an afterlife and more about the potential and the driving force behind our development.
Precisely. And that leads to the third element of this traditional package,
Yeah.
the explanatorily teleological view. This is where things get a bit philosophical.
Hit me with it.
So the idea is that human nature isn't just the blueprint, it's the fully realized form itself. It's the end goal we're naturally inclined to reach. Like the oak tree is the acorn's telos, its ultimate purpose or goal.
So we're not just talking about potential anymore, but about what we're supposed to become.
Exactly. And this leads to the fourth component, the normatively teleological view. This one adds a moral dimension to the equation.
Oh, okay. So now it gets really interesting.
Yeah, this is where they say that this fully developed form, this telos, isn't just what we tend towards, it's what we ought to strive for. It's like there's a built-in moral imperative to reach our full potential as human beings.
Like a cosmic obligation to be the best version of ourselves.
Kind of, yeah. And this is where Aristotle's politics comes in. He argues that this inherent potential has ethical implications for how we organize our societies and how we live our lives. What do you think about that? Does this idea of an inborn ought resonate with you?
It's definitely a powerful concept. I mean, it gives human life a sense of inherent purpose and direction. But it also raises questions, right? Like, who decides what that ought is?
Mhm.
And what happens if someone doesn't or can't reach that ideal? So many questions.
Definitely food for thought. And then, to round out this traditional package, we have the fifth component, the classificatory or taxonomic view.
Okay, that sounds a bit more straightforward.
It seems that way at first glance. This is where they try to define human nature based on the set of properties that distinguish us as Homo sapiens. It's about finding those characteristics that allow us to categorize certain beings as belonging to our species.
So this is where those classic Aristotelian slogans come in, right? Humans as rational animals and political animals.
Exactly. But the entry cautions us to be careful with those slogans. Aristotle used them in different contexts, like when he was talking about zoology versus ethics and politics. And it's not even clear if he meant rational as a strict biological classifier.
Really. So it's not as simple as just saying humans are the only ones who can think.
Not quite. In fact, Aristotle listed a whole bunch of other distinguishing features of humans, some of them pretty unexpected.
Like what?
Well, he mentioned things like having hair on our eyelids and standing upright as characteristics that set us apart.
Hair on eyelids? That's a new one. You don't usually hear that in philosophy debates.
I know, right? It kind of throws a wrench in the whole neat biological definition thing.
It definitely complicates things. So what about rationality then? If it wasn't the only thing that made humans special for Aristotle, what role did it play?
He actually believed that some forms of what he called practical intelligence were shared with other animals. And he even suggested that higher level reasoning and the ability to deliberate might not be universal among all humans.
So even within our own species, there's a spectrum of rationality.
That's what it seems like from his writings. And then the encyclopedia entry points out how later philosophers, like Aquinas and Kant, moved even further away from this strictly biological classification. They shifted the focus to understanding humans as rational substances or examples of rational nature.
Okay, so they're getting more abstract here. What's the significance of that shift?
Well, it opens up the possibility of including non-biological entities in the category of human nature, like maybe angels or a sufficiently advanced AI could also be considered rational substances.
Wow, that's a pretty radical departure from thinking about human nature in purely biological terms.
Absolutely. It shows how complex this concept really is. But things get even more complicated when we introduce the theory of evolution into the mix. I mean, Darwin really shook things up.
Yeah, evolution throws a major curveball into the whole idea of a fixed, unchanging human nature. How did that impact these traditional views?
It had a huge impact, especially on that fifth component, the classificatory view. We no longer see species as fixed types with unchanging essences. Instead, we understand them as evolving populations, constantly adapting and changing over time.
So that whole search for a stable, timeless human essence kind of falls apart when you look at it through the lens of evolution.
Exactly. Variation within a population is essential for evolution to work. If there were some fixed, universal, intrinsic properties that defined us, natural selection wouldn't have anything to act on.
That makes sense. So how does evolutionary biology deal with defining what makes a species, especially when it comes to us humans?
The focus shifts from intrinsic properties to relationships. Things like genealogical connections are placed on the tree of life, and reproductive communities become much more important.
So it's more about shared history and the ability to interbreed than having some specific set of internal characteristics.
Right. But as the entry points out, this has a big consequence. If human nature is just a matter of historical connections and reproduction, it loses a lot of its power to explain why we have the specific traits and behaviors that we do.
So we need to find new ways to understand what makes us in this evolutionary context. And that's where those characteristic and explanatory properties come in, right?
Yes, exactly. Philosophers have been trying to come up with alternative approaches that move beyond essentialism, that don't rely on the idea of a fixed essence. One approach is to define human nature in terms of statistical normality.
Okay, so what does that mean?
Basically, it means looking at the traits and behaviors that are statistically common among human beings. It's about what most people tend to have or do.
So like having 2 arms and 2 legs, being able to walk upright, using language to communicate those sorts of things.
Yeah, those are some examples. But the entry highlights some problems with this approach. What counts as normal depends on which group of humans you're looking at. Like, something that was statistically normal for humans 10,000 years ago might not be statistically normal today.
That's true. Our environments and our lifestyles have changed so much.
Exactly. Plus, this approach is mostly descriptive. It's like making a list of features without really explaining why those features exist or how they relate to each other. It's a bit like just mapping out our mental geography without offering any deeper explanations.
So we need to go beyond just describing what's common and look for the underlying causes and explanations for those characteristics.
Right, and that leads to another approach that focuses on robust causality. This is about identifying those reliable cause and effect relationships that exist within the human species.
Give me an example.
Sure, like we know that exposure to certain viruses causes certain diseases in humans. Or we might find that particular types of early childhood experiences are reliably linked to certain behavioral patterns later in life.
So it's about finding those causal connections that seem to hold true for most, if not all, humans.
Yes, that's the idea. But the entry points out that human nature, from this perspective, becomes more like a collection of different causal links rather than one unified explanation.
I see. So while it's important to understand those causal relationships, it doesn't quite give us that big picture understanding of what makes us human.
Right. So another approach tries to incorporate evolution into the explanation. It argues that we should define human nature as those statistically common properties that have a purely evolutionary explanation.
Meaning those traits that were shaped by natural selection.
Exactly. But the challenge here is that it's incredibly difficult to separate the effects of evolution from the effects of learning and culture.
It's that whole nature versus nurture debate again.
Right. But it's even more complicated than that because our capacity for learning itself is likely a product of evolution. And the environments we live in are so heavily shaped by our social interactions and cultural practices. It's all intertwined.
So untangling those threads is a pretty daunting task.
Mhm.
The entry then brings up the idea of finding a modern blueprint for human nature, but this time in our genes.
Yes, with all the advances in genetics, there's been a push to see our DNA and our complex gene regulatory networks as a kind of blueprint that explains who we are.
So our genes hold the key to understanding human nature.
Well, it's tempting to think that way. Our genes definitely explain a lot about our basic biological features, but the entry cautions us against oversimplifying things.
Okay, so what's the catch?
The catch is that complex traits like rationality, our ability to think and reason, are massively influenced by the environments we grew up in, especially our social environments.
So it's not just nature, it's nurture too.
It's both, working together in complex ways. Our genes might provide a foundation, but our interactions with others and the societies we live in play a crucial role in shaping who we become.
That makes sense. What about the idea of genetically based psychological adaptations? That's a big part of evolutionary psychology, right?
Yes, evolutionary psychology argues that humans share a universal psychological architecture made up of evolved modules. These modules are like mental tools that are the result of natural selection encoded in our genes.
So like pre-programmed instincts.
Kind of, yeah. But there's a lot of debate about how accurate that analogy really is. Critics argue that the selective pressures that shaped human evolution probably varied across different populations, and that natural selection isn't the only evolutionary force at play. Plus, human psychological evolution is likely still ongoing. It's not like we reached some perfect endpoint millions of years ago.
So it seems like this search for a simple, biologically determined human nature keeps hitting roadblocks.
It does, and that's led some philosophers to suggest that maybe we need to abandon this idea of looking for intrinsic properties altogether.
Give up on finding that essential humanness inside of us.
It might be more misleading than helpful at this point. One alternative comes from Richard Boyd, who proposed the concept of homeostatic property clusters, or HPCs.
Okay, that's a mouthful. What are HPCs?
The idea is that natural kinds, including species, might be better understood not as having a single defining essence, but as networks of causally related properties that tend to cluster together. Our shared evolutionary history plays a role in why these properties occur together in a particular species.
So instead of one essential property, it's a bunch of properties that work together and reinforce each other.
Exactly. It's like a complex ecosystem. Instead of focusing on one defining feature, we look at how a whole bunch of traits interact and support each other. And another philosopher, Richard Samuels, suggests that maybe we should think of human nature as the collection of observable mechanisms, both biological and environmental, that drive our psychological development.
So it's not just what we are, but how we become what we are.
Right. And then there's the developmental systems view, proposed by Griffiths and Stotts. They argue that human nature isn't some fixed thing inside of us, but rather the entire dynamic system of the organism and its environment that supports development. They emphasize how much we change and adapt throughout our lives, rejecting the idea of any fixed essence.
So it's less about a blueprint and more about a process.
Precisely. This view is so radical that it makes you wonder if we should even keep using the term human nature, since it might be more confusing than illuminating.
It's a lot to wrap your head around. But then the entry brings up this fascinating idea of secondary altruality.
Huh.
What is that and why is it significant?
This was an observation made by Adolf Portman, who pointed out that human newborns are born in a remarkably helpless state compared to many other animals. They have undeveloped brains and require a ton of care. That's the altricial part. But unlike other species with helpless young, human babies have pretty well-developed sensory abilities.
So they're helpless but aware.
In a way, yeah. And this prolonged period of dependence as infants, coupled with the fact that so much of our brain development happens outside the womb, has huge implications for who we become. Some people refer to this as extragestation, the idea that human development kind of continues outside the mother's body.
So our extended childhood and the fact that our brains continue to develop in a social environment might be key factors in our capacity for learning, our adaptability, and our overall development.
That's the thinking. This heightened plasticity early in life might be a major driving force behind what makes us human, potentially going back to our ancestors like Homo erectus.
So it's not just about our genes, but about how those genes interact with our environment, especially our social environment, over a long period of development.
Right. And it's probably not as simple as finding one single smoking gun that explains everything. It's more likely that a whole constellation of different traits working together through processes like niche construction, where organisms actively shape their environment, which then influences their evolution, has played a role.
It's like a giant feedback loop between our biology, our behavior, and the world around us. Now, the final section of the entry shifts gears a bit, focusing on what it calls the participant perspective and the question of morality. How does the question of human nature look when we consider what it's actually like to be human?
This perspective moves away from trying to be detached scientific observers and asks us to think about the lived experience of being human. It's about what it feels like to navigate the world with our particular set of abilities and limitations. And this is where those traditional philosophical concepts like reason, language, our capacity for symbolic thought, our sense of freedom, our social nature, and our moral inclinations might still be relevant, not necessarily as strict biological definitions, but as ways of capturing key aspects of what it means to be human.
So it's about understanding ourselves from the inside out, not just from the outside in.
Exactly. And this brings us back to the ergon argument, the idea that if something has a function, a good version of that thing performs that function well. If we apply that to humans and say our characteristic function is reason, then a good human life would be one lived in accordance with reason.
But that brings us back to the challenges posed by evolutionary biology. The idea of a fixed, fully developed form seems to clash with the inherent variability and constant change we see in evolution.
You're right. However, contemporary ethicists like McIntyre, Hursthouse, Foote, and Nussbaum have tried to revive this ergon argument in ways that address those challenges.
So they're trying to find ways to talk about human flourishing and a good life without relying on a static, biologically determined notion of human nature.
Yes, that's a big part of it. Some, like Thompson, propose the idea of natural historical descriptions to describe the human life form. But as the entry points out, this raises questions about whether it's just rebranded folk biology.
It sounds like there's still a lot of debate about how to ground our ethical understanding in a way that's both meaningful and scientifically sound.
Absolutely. Nussbaum, for instance, offers what she calls an internal and evaluative theory of human nature, where ethical judgment and the concept of central human capacities determine what counts as a fully human life. But this approach has been criticized for potentially being illiberal, for maybe imposing a particular vision of the good life on everyone. Hursthouse, on the other hand, focuses on human flourishing as involving the use of reason to meet our basic biological and social needs. And McIntyre emphasizes the importance of becoming an independent practical reasoner within social practices, recognizing how much our rationality is shaped by our social interactions.
So they're all grappling with how to connect our understanding of what it means to be human with our ethical aspirations. And then there's the perspective that sees reason as the defining characteristic of human life.
Yes, thinkers like Korsgaard argue that our capacity for reason fundamentally transforms every other aspect of our being. This leads to a view where human nature is less about our biology and more about being a person, a rational agent capable of self-evaluation. And this category could potentially include non-human entities as well.
So maybe what makes us human isn't our species membership, but our capacity for reason and reflection, something that could theoretically exist in other forms of intelligence.
That's the implication. And Scruton takes it even further by proposing a kind of methodological dualism. He says we should study humans as biological animals through scientific methods, but we need a different approach, what he calls Verstein, to understand humans as persons, focusing on their reasons and meanings.
It's a pretty radical idea that what makes us human might not be our biology at all, but our capacity for reason and self-awareness.
It is, and it highlights just how complex and multifaceted this whole concept of human nature really is.
Well, this deep dive has definitely shown that there's no easy answer. We've explored human nature from so many angles: biological, evolutionary, psychological, social, ethical, even metaphysical. It really makes you think about which perspective resonates most with you and why.
And how do these different perspectives shape our understanding of everything from ethics and politics to our everyday interactions with each other? Does the lack of a fixed essence liberate us, or does it create uncertainty about who we are and where we fit in the grand scheme of things?
So many big questions to ponder. This deep dive might even inspire you to explore the works of some of these philosophers in more depth, or to dig deeper into the fascinating world of evolutionary theory and ethics.
Maybe that's part of what it means to be human, this constant questioning, this drive to understand ourselves and our place in the universe. Perhaps the most enduring aspect of human nature is our capacity to ask and debate what it means to be human in the first place.
It's like the journey of self-discovery never really ends.
Exactly. And that journey itself might be the most human thing of all.